unos 5 segundos va a empezar la transmisión.
Ok.
Estamos, Pedro.
Muy bien, gracias Andrea. Muy buenos días a todos. Bueno, nos conocemos, soy Pedro Alonso, jefe del programa de doctorado en Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos, y para mí es un enorme placer tener la oportunidad de organizar estas presentaciones y seminarios junto con las destacadas profesoras Celia, Lury y Deborah Dorotinsky, quien estará mañana. Por lo tanto, voy a presentar a Celia para que ella pueda comenzar su charla, que está seguida también de un seminario. So thank you very much, Celia, for being here with us this morning, this Chilean morning. And it's a real pleasure for us that you being able to join us in this event. We wished we could have you in Chile, same as with Deborah, but certainly the situation is being complicated, but still we are really grateful that you are with us this morning. Celia Lury is founder of the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick, of which she is a professor and researcher. Drawing from her interest in the way living methods represent social worlds, she works on interdisciplinarity methodologies, feminist and cultural theory, sociology of culture, consumer culture, and algorithms. She is co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Interdisciplinary Research Methods. Also, she's author of Invented Methods with Routledge and Measure and Value with Blackwell in 2012, among other publications. Our aim in the context of the program is to have the opportunity to discuss with both Deborah and today Celia on the issue of interdisciplinarity. And so this is being the invitation, and we're really grateful that you are with us today. So I leave you to you, Celia. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to renew my relationship with you and your colleagues. And I think I am the person who is most disappointed that I can't be there. I am dressed up for the cold here in England, and I really wish I could be with you, but I'm very happy to be able to join you in this way and to talk on the topic of interdisciplinarity. I have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to attempt to share that with you, and I'm going to speak then to the PowerPoint quite informally as I go. If there are things you want to raise as I go through, then do that. But I understand we will be able to have a conversation at the end. So, okay, let me try to share my screen. I hope now you can see the PowerPoint with the title. Great. So I've given this the title Interdisciplinarity, a Fashion or the Future. And this is because, that was me. I want to try to address the specificity of doing interdisciplinarity now in the contemporary situation, and the kind of dilemmas as well as the opportunities that offers. And I should start by saying I speak from this position in the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies, and I have here a statement of what the Center aims to do. We contribute to the development of interdisciplinary research by focusing on methodology, and we hope innovate methodologically by doing interdisciplinary research that makes a positive difference in the world. And I think it's important for me to say I am speaking from an interdisciplinary space. I have a commitment to interdisciplinarity. My own history is I was trained in sociology. So I have an undergraduate and a PhD in sociology, but I think my work has always had interdisciplinary components from, in particular, cultural studies and women's studies. And I think it's important to locate oneself in relation to histories of interdisciplinarity in talking about it. Okay, so what I've started with here is a recognition. These are American authors, where they're saying interdisciplinary research is increasingly viewed by funding agencies and policymakers as the philosopher's stone, capable of turning vulgar metal into gold. And I think this is an important kind of context for the emphasis on interdisciplinarity, that there are some internal drivers within the academy, but then there are also external drivers coming from funding councils, coming from policymakers. And that's part of the situation of interdisciplinarity now. And although the philosopher's stone, capable of turning vulgar metals into gold, some people would say it's capable of turning academic research into a profit-making enterprise, if one were to put it crudely. So I think start with that statement. But also wanting to recognize the history of interdisciplinarity and that it's not new, that both disciplines and interdisciplinarity have a history, and perhaps that is more irregular or indisciplined than we are sometimes led to believe, and that it coexists with multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. We've also seen the rise of anti-disciplines, non-disciplines, post-disciplines, and what's described here as redisciplinarizing dynamics. So to point to the ways in which interdisciplinarity has a history, and it's also contested. And my question at the bottom there is, in a way, to ask us to think about, how do disciplines reproduce themselves? Is one of the ways in which they reproduce themselves through interdisciplinarity? Does interdisciplinarity reproduce itself? What kind of relationship is there between disciplines and interdisciplinarity? And that's not a kind of settled matter at all, and varies perhaps in terms of different kinds of formations of interdisciplinarity. So, having raised that notion of interdisciplinarity of the philosopher's stone, I want to put it in the context of a very influential proposal that was made by Helga Novotny, amongst others, where she, in a very kind of wide-ranging schematic account of the emergence of different kinds of knowledge production, talks about a distinction between what they call mode 1 and mode 2 knowledge. So she says, or they say, in traditional society, science is external to society. It's outside society. Society can be hostile to scientific values and methods, and scientists see their task as the benign reconstitution, the remaking of society according to modern principles. And that, they say, is mode 1 knowledge. In mode 2, which they say is now, society is internalized in processes of contextualization and socialization. And science is continually introducing elements of uncertainty into the world, but is at the same time being evaluated in relation to societal imperatives. So that rather than being an autonomous sphere, it's constantly being evaluated in relation to the demands of society, politics, and culture. Now, that account has, of course, been criticized for a variety of reasons, not least perhaps because it's overstated and has happened unevenly. But I think it's interesting and important and provides a context for interdisciplinarity today. Some of the criticisms of that account by Helga Novotny and others are that they are too positive, too accepting of this shift from mode 1 to mode 2 knowledge. And other writers, such as Richard Taboular, have argued that we should be much more critical of this shift, including being critical of interdisciplinarity. So he argues that we need to position the current rise and support for interdisciplinarity in relation to what he calls the growing instrumentalization of knowledge, and which he also, like Novotny, puts in the context of the rise of what's been called a knowledge society. So he's saying interdisciplinarity isn't neutral, apolitical. Instead, he's saying it's a political technology, and it's an attempt to break academics' monopoly on processes and products of higher education, on knowledge production, and it's an attempt to create new academic identities and subjectivity that reflect a corporatist ethos, an ethos that supports the needs of the market-based economy. So he's very critical of the current forms of interdisciplinarity. So, but if we take a step back, think about interdisciplinarity in relation to other forms of cross-narrative, I think these are just really my definitions of multi-trans and interdisciplinarity, but I think they're quite useful as a way of distinguishing themselves. Multidisciplinarity is a kind of additive approach. You add knowledge from one discipline to another, but you don't transform the knowledges of either discipline. Transdisciplinarity aspires to be a more holistic approach that wants to displace disciplinary formations, or at least that's one version of it. Increasingly, at least in the UK, transdisciplinarity has come to be associated with collaboration between the academy and what are variously called partners, users, clients outside the academy. So it's going beyond disciplines, but to what aim is clearly being contested at the moment. But if we stick with interdisciplinarity, this is interaction across and between disciplines. It's important here to emphasize the interaction. It's not simply an addition of disciplines, one on top of the other, but it's about their interaction. In a study of interdisciplinarity in the UK, Barry Bourne and Veskelins identify 3 different forms of interdisciplinarity, which try to get at the power dynamics in that interaction between disciplines. They identify 3 different forms, one of which they call integrative or synthesis, where the disciplines come together and are integrated and form some kind of synthesis. The second form they identify is one they characterize as of subordination or service. This is normally social sciences or humanities being subordinate to science. So social sciences can add society to science, or art can communicate science. They're in a subsidiary secondary role. The third form that Barry, Bourne, and Veskelins identify is what they called on a kind of continuum between agonistic and antagonistic, where the disciplines are in critical interaction with each other, and there may be a degree of friction. So it's not about synthesis, it's not about the disappearance of disciplines, but there are these interferences between disciplines. And disciplines themselves may be transformed in the process. And here at the bottom, another question. I think it's interesting to think about these different forms of interdisciplinarity in relation to these various sites of interdisciplinarity. Women's studies, cultural studies, data science, urban studies, biochemistry, environmental humanities, humanitarian engineering, we have that at Warwick, science and technology studies. Kind of how would you characterize the power relations between disciplines in these fields? Barry, Bourne, and Veskelins also, in their study, which was an empirical study looking at practices of interdisciplinarity in the UK, suggest that interdisciplinarity is presented in terms of making science accountable to society. And in that sense, the kind of subordinate service role for humanities and social sciences is one that is kind of built in a way, they suggest, in current forms of interdisciplinarity. However, they are very keen to emphasize that that isn't inevitable. They argue crucially that it is possible for interdisciplinarity to demonstrate autonomy, academic autonomy, to be able to set its own questions and not be accountable to society, but rather to the academy. So they end up saying autonomy may be associated as much with interdisciplinary as with disciplinary research. And I agree with that. However, I think it is also worth emphasizing that accountability to society, or perhaps to nature, can be understood in a variety of different ways. And I'm very struck by those people arguing for what are sometimes called indigenous methodologies. So Catriona Elder, Jonathan Potskin describe indigenous methodologies in terms of an inalienable connection of indigenous peoples to specific geographic spaces. So in Australia, they say it's custodianship of indigenous peoples to land and the responsibility built into that relationship that informs indigenous methodology. So I think they're saying here, there is a kind of accountability going on, but it's not necessarily accountability to, for example, policymakers. It's accountability to the land. And Margaret Kovacs says something similar in relation to Native American Indian epistemology. So says, while I speak of knowledges, it should be assumed that they are nested, created, and recreated within the context of relationships with other living beings. I think this is a really important kind of alternative way of thinking about accountability in terms of responsibility. And I think it's a useful counterbalance to some of the arguments that get developed in Europe and North America about, oh, we should not think about, we should defend ourselves from pressure to be accountable. I think it matters who you're accountable to or what you're accountable to and how. Okay, so I've tried to map out some of the context for contemporary interdisciplinarity. But I also wanted to talk about the practice of interdisciplinarity, actually doing it. I think the context is important to understand what the opportunities are, what the dilemmas are. But if you are going to do it, how can we do it in a way that is responsible and exciting? So I'm going to talk briefly now about some of the issues there. Okay, so start here once again, returning to the authors who talk about interdisciplinarity as being a philosopher's stone. They also conducted some studies of interdisciplinary research. And what I like about what they found is they talk about the importance of a cognitive, emotional, and interactional platform of interdisciplinary research. And I think this is really, really important because I think you can talk about interdisciplinarity in sort of technical terms, in terms of epistemology or methodology or other ways of doing it in quite a technical way. But they really point to the importance of doing interdisciplinarity with all the kind of different dimensions that involves. So they say, in the shared space, researchers define problems to study, exchange expertise, but also build personal relations, project and maintain academic self-concepts. They yoke for status. What they create together constitutes a basis that shapes how they collaborate with each other. And they point to the importance of shared language, key concept, tacit rules of interaction, group culture, identity, and collective mission. I think this is really, really significant and important to look at that kind of working practice of interdisciplinarity. Although I think also here they emphasize group or collaborative interdisciplinarity. And I think one question which may be relevant and we can discuss later is whether you as an individual or me as an individual, can I be interdisciplinary? I've said my background was sociology, but I've engaged in women's studies, cultural studies, to some degree science and technology studies. Can I do interdisciplinarity, or does it always have to be in relation to others from other disciplines? So I think the question of whether interdisciplinarity can be done by an individual researcher is important, whilst also I think what's said here about the necessity for creating a platform is really important. Then, if we think about that platform, and think about the different kinds of cultures that are associated with different disciplines, and the different aims and ambitions of different disciplines, I think you can pull out kind of axes of interdisciplinary research and find very significant differences between disciplines here. So I've listed some disciplines, possibly interdisciplinary fields on the left, and then some questions, some axes along which they might differ. So I've said my background is in sociology, and sociology has for a long time, or some parts of the discipline, have had really placed a great emphasis on the notion of critique. And one issue there is, can you conduct a critique if you are inside society? Does sociology imagine that it is still outside society? And if so, where is it if it's not inside society? We've also simultaneously given up on the God's eye view. If we are inside, how can we do critique? And I've been in interdisciplinary projects where just kind of the aim or the possibility of developing a critique has been kind of beside the point, or irrelevant, or actually counterproductive with members of other disciplines. On the other hand, sociology is often extremely critical of collaboration in terms of those arguments about academic autonomy. If we think about methodology, I've said I come from a Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies. My experience there has been that many disciplines in the humanities have been like, we don't have a methodology, so you're excluding us. It's not significant. It's not important methodology in, for example, English. And I reply by saying, well, actually reading is a methodology. Critical reading is a methodology. Surely that counts. But the question of whether and how something like methodology, which the centre takes as a basis for doing interdisciplinary research, is contested by some disciplines. Should research be evidence-based, designed to produce evidence? What does it mean if research is practice-based? Will that lead to evidence? How do we identify when research produces something original? Is that significant? Should the research be reproducible? How do we acknowledge authorship? I think if you ask those questions of the disciplines on the left, you would get different answers in relation to all of them. And I think that's the fact that you would is one of the reasons why developing that platform becomes really, really important. This is got too much text on this slide, but I've put it here just because I think that it's all important. I'm very taken by an argument made by Gad and Brun Jensen for the importance of concepts of the lateral. And I have appropriated that for methods of the lateral as a way of understanding the doing of interdisciplinarity, because I think the term lateral draws attention to many relations across and between disciplines. So I'm really emphasizing it here, and I'm working with that notion of interdisciplinarity as being about interference between disciplines and about kind of making friction between disciplines, and to see the links between disciplines as kind of active conduits of provocation between disciplines, and that it's necessary and important to explore differences and asymmetries between disciplines in relation to specific problems. And then on the left there, I give, Pedro kindly mentioned that I'm one of the editors of the Routledge Handbook, International Handbook of Interdisciplinary Research Methods. And I have here a number of the methods introduced by a variety of the contributors. And all of them are speaking to how this process of the many-to-many relations across and between disciplines can be done. And I think all of these accounts here recognize the kinds of difficulties that are associated with that, and point to the ways in which that cognitive, emotional, interactive platform that I mentioned earlier is created. So we have here from Jane Calvert, wedging, where she talks about 3 disciplines brought together in a project. The disciplines were synthetic biology, critical design, and science and technology studies. And as she says, they themselves are hybrid, heterogeneous, and relatively young. But what they had in common, the wedge that she identifies, was that they were all resisting the industrialization of biology. So whilst one might have thought that biology wasn't necessarily concerned with critique, for example, the particular biologists involved wanted to resist the industrialization of biology, and they could yoke themselves together, people from design, science and technology studies, to develop a project together. Michael talks about compromising, which he describes as putting forward together. It's not seamless or integrated, but a staging of care. So he is talking about the importance of care in developing interdisciplinary research. Carl DeSalvo talks about deriving. And here he's saying it's kind of, it's not that you come into an interdisciplinary project in full possession of a concept or an idea that you want to take forward. You derive a problem, an approach, by drawing it out from something else. And so he sees the process of interdisciplinary collaboration as one of deriving by modification. And in particular, he says, speaking of a specific project, what we derive from design as a mode of making us inquiry is not solutions, but rather productive glitches, difficulties, and complications. Disrupting, Yoko Okama and Sarah Pink they talk about an improvisatory process that corrupts ethnographic and design principles, disrupting and corrupting. A final example here, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail with the next slide, is about explaining. I was particularly struck by this entry from Priska Gisler, who is a science technologist, sociology person, but was on a project with an artist, and who found the artists' relation to the work they were producing very challenging, in the sense that not only was the artwork not supposed to explain the problem that it addressed, the artist was not willing to explain the artwork either. And this seemed to Priska Gisler somewhat kind of counterproductive. But she ended up thinking about it in a way that I think is quite interesting, and pulls out some of the tensions between art and social science here. So she says, the research team has to bear in mind the differences in social science and art worlds, in which there is, in social science, critique, debate, and closure. Whereas in the art world, there is silence. The artist doesn't attempt to explain their work, although I know, of course, some artists do, but in this case, they didn't. Silence, distribution, and proliferation. And she talks about how the artist, by claiming to hold back her own explanation, effectively obliges others to do the talking. By directing most of the attention towards the work itself, ironically, she enables its mobility. And I think this is a really interesting opposition or contrast in terms of kind of why are we doing what we're doing, and the different aims and ambitions of different disciplines, where social science might want to reach closure. We might want to know the reason why a particular form of inequality persists. We don't want the explanation to be continually remade. We want to be able to explain, identify the problem, debate the possible responses, and then find some kind of solution or offer some kind of way forward. And art challenges that. Okay, now this is me talking a bit more personally about my own experience of interdisciplinarity, and in particular, a project that I'm currently working on, which is called People Like You, Contemporary Figures of Personalization. And this is a project which is funded, a funding body that emphasizes interdisciplinarity, and in which it's funded as a collaborative project across institutions, and is described as medical humanities, which is an interdisciplinary field which I have never been part of before. The three PIs on the project, there's me with my background that I've told you about, Sophie Day, who is an anthropologist, and Helen Ward, who works in public health and is an epidemiologist. So we have a variety of disciplines. Then we have a number of postdocs who themselves come from different backgrounds, sociology, media theory, and one person with a background in medical humanities. We collaborated with artists. We are interested in personalization. All of us have an interest in personalization, but we actually conceptualize it very differently. And one of the significant, as it were, fault lines in the project is between those who have an investment in personalization. And if you're not clear what I'm meaning by personalization, just briefly, that title, people like you like things like this, which you may be familiar with from recommendation algorithms in Netflix or Spotify or various Amazon recommendation services, where there are more and more fine-grained targeting of specific individuals. We have different conceptualizations of personalization, but we have a very different investment in them, in that Helen, the public health epidemiologist, is embedded in a faculty of medicine and works very closely with medics and data scientists who are attempting to use, for example, genomic testing to personalize medicine more accurately. I have a background in sociology. I have an interest in branding and consumer culture. So my understanding of personalization draws on my knowledge of branding and advertising and targeting individuals. So we stand in very different positions in relation to them, in that Helen has a significant investment in actually thinking that personalization will improve care for people. If I think about personalization in relation to advertising, understand personalization into issues of privacy and the growth of a consumer culture, and I might be more critical. But we're working across personalization across these domains. And so we need to negotiate that. We need to be able to think about, is personalization always bad? Is it always good? Does it always address issues of privacy? What does it mean if the categories by which we're classified become more and more fine-grained? And what thankfully we have found is that many of the issues present in one domain are also present in the second domain, but with very different kind of implications. Nevertheless, some of the same processes are going on. But at another level still, there are issues to do with, for example, methodology. So, as I said, Sophie is an anthropologist. So she has a notion of, she doesn't accept that individuals are discrete, isolated atoms. Yet that assumption of the individual is at the heart of many epidemiological methodologies, where you just assume the individual as a discrete individual, and you don't situate them in terms of their relations with others. So that at a methodological level, how do we think about the person in personalization? That can either be a barrier to interdisciplinary discussion, Or, as we found after some painful discussions, it's a very interesting kind of site to begin to think about changes in the ways in which the person is thought about in and constituted in practices of personalization. So that's some indication, but I also did want to talk about a project that is linked to people like you. And this is a project with colleagues in Santiago, and in particular with Matthias Tironi and Matthias Valderrama, which is called Algorithmic Identities, in which this was an international as well as an interdisciplinary project in which we tried to prototype a recommendation app, an app that would say, people like you like things like this. And the team that was involved, it involved sociology, anthropology, design, computer science, and media theory. And we did develop a prototype together, but there were some of the same issues arise here. And I think they intersect with issues to do with internationalization, international collaboration, how we was able to set this up across universities, across countries, but also the question of which questions were useful and why. Why were we doing the study? And with the prototyping methodology, which in itself I think is really interesting, the success that the prototyping methodology that we adopted here has been taken up in, for example, social science, and why that methodology has gained a real significance, moving from design through to social science, and the way in which social science is coming to think about the value of making things as well as explaining them is one thing. The other thing is this idea of maybe social science doesn't necessarily want to close off its response to ongoing issues. A prototyping methodology enables you to have a kind of iterative process of continuing to explore, being reflexive about your methods. And at the same time, we also, in the group of people, a computer scientist who in a sense doesn't have the same investment necessarily in a never-ending process of prototyping, and might want to end that process of prototyping, and might, for example, want to commercialize the recommendation app that we had produced, which wasn't necessarily of direct interest to the rest of us in that group, so that we had very different investment in that methodology and what it might produce. So I think I've just opened up what I hope is a can of worms, really, in terms of thinking about interdisciplinarity, in terms of trying to address the context for it. And I think that's really important to think about why and how you want to be involved in interdisciplinarity. And then trying to give some of the often not explicit, practical, emotional, interactive issues that are also present when disciplines are brought together. So I'm going to stop there, I think, and stop sharing. screen. And yeah, I'll finish here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Celia. It's been great. Deborah is raising hand. Deborah?
Gracias, Pedro. Well, I will speak in English. I'm sorry. I hope everybody understands. Celia, that was a very provocative lecture. Thank you. Great talk. And I want to ask you, what is to be done with concepts? I am considering Miquel's this idea of migrant concepts in the humanities in particular. I am an art historian, but I was formed an undergraduate in anthropology, cultural anthropology. So I have a social science background as well. So what do you think about concepts migrating between what is to be done? What should we tell the students when concepts migrate from one discipline to the other?
Thank you. That's a great question. And one which I have bitter experience of, in that I have tried to develop an idea as the concept of social or cultural topology. And topology is a term that has been developed in mathematics and geography, but not, and also in anthropology, but the disciplines that have been most antagonistic to my use of a notion of topology has been mathematics, where they are very proprietary. And they want to insist that their use of this notion of topology is the only correct one. And that has been quite bruising, the encounters with mathematicians. But I also want to take it very seriously, because I think that if concepts migrate, which they do, I don't think it makes sense to say there is a single origin. For most concepts have multiple origins, and that you can provide different histories, genealogies of a concept. And I think that is one way forward, because you still want to hold on to a concept can't mean whatever you want it to mean. Not quite. You need to be able to locate it into a history, which can be more or less disciplinary or interdisciplinary. And I think the other thing to do is to really take seriously the other histories, because there is a lot to be learnt from them. And I don't think they should be discarded, even if the encounters are sometimes quite harsh. So I think they're incredibly important. I don't think they necessarily solve some of the problems of interdisciplinary research, precisely because people from different disciplines use concepts which appear to be shared in very different ways. But yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I would like to apologize. We are at the end of the semester here in UNAM in Mexico City, so I cannot miss my class, which takes place the following hours. So I thank you for the lecture. I think it's wonderful. I'm reshaping my lecture for tomorrow. So
I'll be there tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay.
But I will be back again in an hour. Thank you so much. And
Okay.
me disculpo con todos. Vuelvo en una hora. Gracias.
Muy bien, gracias, Deborah. Thank you. So I just wonder if there would be any other questions for Celia before we come to an end with this first part of the session. If anyone wants to share a thought or a question.
I have one.
Mm-hmm.
Celia, thank you for your lecture. And I have a question. Do you think that there is a, I don't know, maybe a discipline that could act as a facilitator to communicate other disciplines to work together, like design, for example?
Like what? Sorry?
Design or academic design.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question too. I guess that different disciplines have the capacity to work across other disciplines differently, I think. I agree that I would say at the moment, design is that discipline. As I've said, that kind of take up of prototyping as a methodology, I think has been really significant and felt across many, many disciplines. And I think alongside that, the emphasis on making, that has transformed many other disciplines that didn't previously engage with making. I think the question of collaboration, design is very interesting there. I said we worked with 3 artists on the project People Like You. In a way, I should correct myself because we had 2 who identified as artists and 1 who identified as a designer. And whenever she presented her work in the context of others, she differentiated it in terms of she understood her work in terms of working for a client to a specific brief, whereas the artists did not understand what they were doing in those terms. And one of the things we've been reflecting on is kind of how can you collaborate across disciplines with artists and designers? And I think that's an interesting question. I am not sure that design necessarily, I'm sure design doesn't just have that notion of working with a client. The specific designer we worked with did, and I know other designers don't. But I think in relation to those issues, at least, design has that capacity. But I also reflect back on, for example, sociology, my original discipline, where in the 80s, sociology, I remember I was in a sociology department then, and one as a junior lecturer, and one of the senior professors there described sociology as an imperial discipline in a positive way, in the sense that it was colonizing other disciplines, and saw itself as sort of reaching out and being able to encompass other disciplines. Sociology no longer would aspire to do that. And I don't think necessarily would do it successfully, even if it tried. And there were various skirmishes around, was women's studies really just sociology? Was cultural studies really just sociology? And I think it's there a bit now with science and technology studies. Is science and technology studies really just sociology? It's just a subfield of sociology with a little bit of anthropology and design thrown in. You know, is it still this imperializing sociology discipline, but nobody calls it that anymore? And it's actually more effective if you don't call it a kind of master discipline that works across others. So I don't know that there's a single discipline that can do that. And I don't know that we would want there to be a single discipline. And how that discipline might be able to make connections across disciplines is what really matters, I think. How you can do that respectfully, not in an imperial mode.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Okay, great. Serena, yes?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Celia, for your presentation. Was great. And I have a question. I was thinking about the dichotomy between like the research founding policies, which are very focused on individual competence, and your question about how to be interdisciplinary as an individual researcher. And so I was wondering about, have you experimented with forms of collaboration that allow you to, in some way, sort of hack these individual paradigms behind these founding policies? I don't know if my question is clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
No. I think that's there. I think I get what you're getting at. In terms of my own experience, I have always, as soon as I think I was thinking about PhD research and how there is that very strong emphasis on the individual, although in some disciplines that is countered by you do your PhD in a carefully defined field by your supervisor, who is leading a project on something or other, and they identify your project for you. But in many other disciplines, it's just this very individualistic emphasis. And I think the way I countered that and continue to do that is by being part of different networks, is by being in reading groups with people from different disciplines, by attending interdisciplinary conferences, presenting your work to different audiences. I think you can, the extent to which you can do that as an individual PhD researcher is somewhat limited, but I think you can start that practice. And then, I do think that for good or bad, there is this emphasis on collaborative, team-based work now that kind of enables you to build on those connections and collaborations. And I also think co-authorship is a really challenging but productive way to develop that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. Because I find if I'm writing with people from different disciplines, all sorts of things that I really would have thought, oh, why are they challenging that? Just the sentence construction, let alone anything else, you find the kind of assumptions built into a discipline by writing with other people. So that too I would do. Yeah, but I agree, it's an interesting challenge.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Celia, and thank you for all the questions. I think we of course, we will have now a seminar, so we could continue with the questions and with this conversation in the next few minutes. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Celia. And if I may say, then maybe we have a short break of 10 minutes and we are back. Just to keep with the way we organize this, there is a different link for the seminar, which I'm putting now that link into the chat too, but it's also being sent by email. So we could join again in 10 minutes in this different meeting room. So thank you, Celia. Let's have a little break and see you in a bit.
See you in a bit. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you very much.